Tech Sounds presents EduTrends.
Welcome to EduTrends, presented by the Institute for the Future of Education. This is a Tech Sounds podcast, the official podcast of Tecnológico de Monterrey. My name is José Pepe Escamilla. I'm Associate Director of the Institute for the Future of Education. Today's guest is Ellen Boeren, a professor of education at the University of Glasgow. Ellen, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me, and good to see you.
Good to see you again. Yes. Ellen, I would like to start a question with a question that is personal. So The question will not be so difficult, so don't panic. The question is, why did you choose education as a career, and when did you decide to focus on your efforts in adult education, adult development?
Well, it is actually quite a difficult question, I have to say. I think some of it is maybe happenstance. I mean, it's basically when I was 18-year-old and finalized secondary school. Then, of course, when you go to higher education nowadays, but also back in the days around the year 2000, when I started my journey in higher education, there's quite a lot of options to choose from. So yeah, I was actually at the time one of the leaders in like a youth group. Enjoyed that quite a lot. So basically at that time decided to train as a teacher. So my first degree was actually a bachelor teacher training degree. But then, at that point, when you finish it, you're 21 years old and you still have the option to either do a master's or immediately go into the teaching profession. I decided to then take a master's on top of that. And then actually, because I had good results, etc., I managed to get a PhD scholarship. But then my journey into adult education, I'd say that was really happenstance, because I had this master's in educational studies and I wanted to do a PhD because I really liked doing research. But I was actually applying for studentships, and I actually ended up on a big project that was about comparative study on adult education in 13 countries across Europe. Now, if I had applied for another job where I basically had done something about medical education, for example, my career might have looked differently. But I think I've also been interested in sort of having something that is fairly analytical in focus, but also that sort of tries to understand the human behavior, the human relationships, the structures of society. So I think, going to a more exact sciences degree or going more into like a medical route, for example, that hasn't really been on my radar. I really wanted to do something that was a bit more social sciences type degree. And then, of course, as I think it's with quite a lot of things, the more you get to know about something, and once you sort of really try to, sort of manage to get the in-depth knowledge and expertise, then of course it becomes more enjoyable as well, because you see the challenges, you see the sort of the bigger questions, you understand things better. And yeah, so that's a bit how my career developed from my sort of mid-20s onwards in becoming this expert in adult education, specifically about participation studies. I still think it's interesting. Otherwise, I would have given up on it. But it's still something that keeps me going, and which I guess will keep my career going for the next 20 years or so.
That's very interesting. I say always that sometimes when we don't know something, we don't know that we don't know. No, so we go into one field and we learn, but we also expand the limits of our ignorance. No, so we have to be able to understand and learn more, and that's what makes it fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah.
Was that a work that you did in the OECD?
No. Well, yes and no. So if we basically go back to the mid 2000s, Leuven University in Belgium at that point won a 4.2 million euros project that was sponsored by the European Commission. And that was a study about formal adult education. And that was also the project I did my PhD on. But then after I got my PhD, left Belgium, went to the UK, and then I actually had a job for 7 years at the University of Edinburgh. And one of the schemes that the OECD did in the mid-2010s was called the Thomas Alexander Fellowship. And the aim of the Thomas Alexander Fellowship was for scholars who are interested in working with one of the data sets from the OECD to do a project about that. So I did a 1-year fellowship with them to work on the PIAC data, so data from the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And I did a project with them on the participation and non-participation of migrants. So people who are not born in the country in which they, at the time of the survey, lived, and see what impact their foreign-born status actually had on their chances to participate in education and training as an adult. So that's what I did at the OECD.
Okay, interesting. Because I asked that because I at your conference last January in IFE, your presentation in IFE Conference 2025 here in Monterrey, Mexico, this January, you talk about the PIAC, this survey of adult skills. Can you share some of the key findings of that study and why is it relevant? What implications it have for the development of adult competencies?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, the PIAC stands for Program for the International Adults. PIAC stands for the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, and that is actually a bit like in line with the OECD's earlier work on, for example, the International Adult Literacy Survey that they did. But in 2012, they released the data from the first cycle of PIAC, and now in December 2024, they released the second cycle. And if we actually look into OECD's work, probably more people in the field of education more likely will be familiar with PISA. PISA is the Program for the International Student Assessment. That is done every 3 years, but not with adults, but with pupils in schools who are 15 years old. Now, PIAC actually picks up there where PISA ends. So it is really like a survey, but also a survey that has a direct assessment of skills from 16-year-old onwards through adult life. So it has direct measurements of literacy skills, numeracy skills, problem-solving skills. And apart from that, it also has a background questionnaire attached to it where adults can fill in questions about their professional backgrounds, but also whether they participate in education and training. So PIAC is actually quite important in that sense that it gives us some insights in the true skill levels of adults. And you see, for example, that in quite a chunk of the countries, you still sit with a population that is the adult population, but that actually, according to the OECD's framework of what sort of level of skills you need to make it your contribution to society, to survive, to maintain your sort of life circumstances, etc. You need to have a certain level, and that we actually see that quite a percentage still sits under that. So that is basically indicating that it is, typically you would expect that people leave schools with a certain set of cognitive skills, that they'll be able to read well, to do basic calculations, etc. That you need adult education systems across the world to basically help adults who maybe had interrupted educational pathways throughout their early lives, to offer them things like second chances. Now, the focus on the sort of skills is something my own research focuses less on, because my research mainly focuses on what is in the background questionnaire and how we can actually see which adults do or do not participate in education and training activities. And that is actually where PIAAC is helpful, because it measures participation in formal education activities where people, by the end of their journey, if they then pass the assessments, get an official qualification, but also the non-formal participation. So do people do on-the-job training? Do they follow courses? Do they maybe take private lessons, etc.? And that really leads us to a better understanding, not only of who participates as an individual, but because there's so many countries in those surveys, it also tells us something about the different approaches that countries use to either stimulate or not stimulate the uptake of learning among the adult population in their country.
Mm-hmm. And what are the things that we can learn from these studies? Do you have some examples of learning points?
I mean, first of all, I want to say that the PIAAC data are only out fairly recently. So I haven't done an in-depth analysis on the data myself, but I've worked in the last few months more extensively with another data set, which is the Eurostat Adult Education Survey, which was collected by the European Commission. So therefore, it only has European countries in there. But what you really see there is that the participation patterns in adult education, both formal, non-formal, they keep on being stubbornly unequal between different groups in society. So one of the biggest factors in explaining participation versus non-participation is based on educational attainment. So people who have not finalized upper secondary schooling are way less likely to participate in adult education activities compared to people who have tertiary education degrees. A second very strong factor here is the age factor. You really see the participation rates go down once people get older. And the explanation for that is, because once you get older, you get more experience in the labor market, yes, but your time horizon on the labor market also gets shorter. So the incentive for you, the return on investments, might also become shorter the closer you get to retirement. And that might also put off, for example, employers, the sort of reason to invest in education and training. Now, apart from that, what we really see from those data as well is that, maybe contrary to popular belief among academics working in this area, is that actually quite a lot of people show no interest in lifelong learning and participation in adult education. So if we're talking about the 27 countries that form part of the European Union, we actually see from the latest data that if you ask people whether they were interested, whether they participated in adult education, if they said no, and you asked whether they were interested in participation and they also said no, out of an adult population between the ages of 25 and 64, out of 100 people of that population, you actually have 42 people in Europe who said, I did not participate and I also didn't want to. So that is actually a fairly big group. Now, if you ask the people who did not participate, but who wanted to, what the main barriers were that prevented their participation, the main explanations there actually relate to two factors. First one is a lack of time. And there you see a bit of a gender split, right? Like women are more likely to say that they're too busy with organizing their family life and childcare, etc. And men are actually more likely to say, yeah, I don't have a time because I'm too busy with my work schedule and I have a busy job, etc. The second explanation is actually the financial resources, right? Like some courses can actually be quite expensive, but not just expensive in terms of fees or books that you have to buy for certain courses, but also if it's very time intensive course, it might take time away from you being active in your job. You might have to lower your working hours and therefore, earn less for a while until you reinvest in your education. And those can all be factors that actually make it more difficult for you to decide that you wanna participate.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it is also something that, in my experience working with adults that are doing a master's, I had a lot of experience in the past. Those are two big reasons for quitting a program once they are registered. One of them is the lack of time, and the other one is financial resources. And in general, people that are already having a family life or working, they tend to prioritize family or work over study. So, for instance, an illness, a new car, a new house will be always more priority in terms of financial resources, putting some financial resources, and work also will be part of that in order of time. So for me, one of the key things here is if it's possible to show how the investment of time and resources now in postponing a new house or a new car or something in work can be beneficial in the longer term. It's a better return, let's say, on the investment for them. So how can we show that to adult learners?
Yeah. So one of the things here is actually going back to data, like, for example, PIAC or data from the Eurostat Adult Education Survey. These data at the moment are not really longitudinal in nature. No, for example, in Germany, they've done a bit of work on doing longitudinal follow-up on participants from the PIAC 2012 one. But actually, in the majority of countries, we don't have a longitudinal follow-up on these data. But there are actually some good national data sets out in some countries, for example, in the UK, where you can track people for a lengthier period of time. And I've actually just won a new project from the Economic and Social Research Council in the United Kingdom, where we're going to do that. So where basically for the last sort of 13, 14 years, we will be able to see like, okay, here you have a group of people and people who might be fairly similar to each other, but at a certain point, they take different decisions in terms of the training or the education pathways that they follow, and then to track them over a lengthy period of time, not just, like 6 months after their course ends or only a year, but really for like following them up for a decade, retrospectively, of course, because the data have already been collected. But one of the reasons why something like that is important is because, it's basically what in economic terms, they often refer to as the lock-in effect. If someone basically says like, look, you need to make the initial investments in your training and you need to pay a sum of money and you need to spend some time out of the labor market. Of course, for 1 or 2 years, there might not be a lot of money coming in. But if you have a family or whatever, you want the bread on the table, right? You want to have an income, you want to feed your family. But actually, it might well be that within 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that initial investments start paying off. And that is here one of the paradoxes, right? Because somehow, whatever step you take, you're never, ever 100% guaranteed that the outcomes will be there. So it is always a bit of a judgment on what you think you might expect but whether the expectation is really going to materialize. So that is actually why we really need to do more of this longitudinal research to really have more sort of probabilities on, okay, you invest in this type of course, in this sort of situation, what are your chances that you will really get a good, return on benefit here? But even then, I mean, the world changes rapidly, circumstances change rapidly, but we just need more evidence on those true outcomes. Now, the evidence that we have on outcomes of education and training, what you see quite often presented in reports by, for example, the European Commission or the OECD, is that there is a good correlation between educational attainments in countries and the sort of the wealth of countries. Like, think about, for example, the Scandinavian region in Europe, where you see like, okay, you have high participation rates in adult education. You have typically better educated, above average educated populations. And in these countries, people also score higher on average on measures such as, for example, health and well-being, happiness, etc. But these are more macro level correlations. And I'm really excited that we got this new project, because it will really help us to individualize the personal outcomes for certain pathways that people take as well. So, that is definitely, something that we need more of.
Yes, very interesting remarks and findings. And I would like to go into the, you mentioned the rapid changes that are going on right now. And these rapid advancements, many of them are related to technology. And in particular, I think that now AI is playing a big role, at least in the discussions, no? So how do you see digital learning, digital technologies, artificial intelligence shaping the future of adult competencies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what we definitely see is that, there is a bit of a sort of overload of learning opportunities that are there now. So I suppose it will be a bit of a way of making sure that people know where to find information, etc. And that is sort of, I think, I think with these sort of issues, I'm always a bit, maybe a bit careful in saying it will make a lot of changes or whatever. I think it definitely will, but it will also, maybe be a bit at a different speed for different people based on their starting positions. Because if we basically look into the groups of people that come out of surveys like PIAC or the Adult Education Survey, whose literacy skills aren't very sophisticated, who basically, maybe are in jobs where they don't have to be, working with technology all the time nowadays, that you also run the risk of sort of, creating some digital exclusion for certain groups in society. So I think that is definitely something where, not just in adult education, but from a very young age onwards. I know, in recent years and after the pandemic, a lot has been written in the press about, what about screen time for little children? Or is it good that every primary school kid is sitting there with their iPads all the time? I'm totally not an expert on that, but I do think that it's important for people who, we now have actually, students in our classes in higher education who will live on to the year 2100, right? It's maybe difficult to,
wow.
but it will be the case, someone who's born in 2006 and who has now entered higher education for the first year, they will be, 94 in 2100. So they will be there. Lots of them, a certain proportion of the students we have now will be there. Kids in primary school will sort of, quite a lot of them will get to see the year 2100.
Yes, you're right.
So it is actually important for them to, from a young age onwards, to get these skills. But also at the same time, we countries will inevitably have to invest in digital skills training. Workplaces will have to invest in it as well, because there is fairly recent publications out there. There's a paper that was published by my colleague Alexandra Ioannidou, who works at the Deutsche Institut für Erwachsenenbildung, was together with a co-author, that actually, if you look into people who participate less in adult education and training, are actually those people whose jobs are most at risk of automation, right? So again, you there have a bit of a paradox. There's a group of people who run the risk of having their jobs taken over by machines, by artificial intelligence, by automation. But are they getting the access to the right learning opportunities to maybe flow into other jobs? So I suppose it's always a bit about having a balance between upskilling and reskilling, because of course throughout life you can get to know more and more and more and more about the same thing, and really skill yourself up. But at certain points, people will also have to reskill and have to learn how to work with the technologies if they want to keep their job. Now, what it's really gonna do in terms of provision of learning activities, I think there it's a bit like the informational barrier, and making sure that people know where to find the information, that people see the relevance of what they're doing, and what in the end ends up as online education in the leading surveys, for example. I remember actually from the IFE conference that I think it was one of the keynote speakers who basically said, like, well, a few years ago, we spoke a lot about MOOCs, for example, but have MOOCs really changed the landscape in terms of how many adult learners we attract these days? We also know that MOOCs, for example, don't have very high completion rates. People enroll, then maybe, dip in and dip out. But it's not that it automatically leads to course completion. It's there the question also a bit like, what are really the skills that people pick up from these things? I think, to me, one of the things that this technology is really doing is creating some further fuzziness in these boundaries between what we typically classify as formal, non-formal, informal learning. Because, if you go back like maybe, let's say 50 years in time, and 50 years ago, you would ask people about what is adult education, they probably think about, an after-hour class where you sit in a building, in a traditional classroom with an adult educator, a group of maybe 15 to 20 adults who learn together. And if that was formal education, that at the end of the course, you had to do an assessment, take an exam, and then you got a qualification. Now, with so many things that you can learn online, with the provision of like private providers entering the field, even things like learning new things on asking ChatGPT a question and increasing your knowledge and your skills about that will, of course, not just have a knock-on effect for the adult education sector, but also for the entire labor market sector. Like, what are traditional recruitment mechanisms that employers, for example, are going to use? Because you can actually not have a lot of qualifications, but if you're very savvy in working with the artificial intelligence tools that come on, you can actually be very knowledgeable without having the official educational credentials. And that's a bit like, I think it will even further than it is already today. Maybe have a bit of a mixing up between what we typically see as the education debate and what we typically see as the skills debate.
Yes, and this possibilities also of learning. We have seen also that MOOCs, for instance, were supposed to be more inclusive and give access to everyone. But in fact, most of the users of MOOCs are people that are already well educated. So I will chain this with my last question to you, for this conversation. What do we need to change in the ecosystem, in the adult learning ecosystem that includes many different actors, like governments, educational institutions, private providers, other tools people learn on the job, but they are not necessarily certified. What do we need in this learning ecosystem to make it more inclusive?
Yeah, I think, what I actually said before, I am very, very happy that I won this new project where I can finally do and have some time and be able to hire, work with postdocs on a project that goes deeper into the longitudinal data, because we need to be way more upfront and have way more in-depth knowledge on what the benefits really are. But I think it's also governments across the world and employers, etc. as well, really need to understand in the first place that it is an ecosystem. Because I think what sort of maybe a bit changing in the countries that I've studied in recent years, but it wouldn't really sort of be so strange that you have in a country a Ministry of Labor and a Ministry of Economics, or Ministry of Labor and Economics, Ministry of Education. And, they sit only a few streets away from each other in the same city, but actually they don't really know each other. So one of the difficulties compared to initial and compulsory education is that the sort of need for working together across the stakeholders is way more complex than if you do primary school education, for example, where it's compulsory, it's official, it's in most countries delivered in this one type of, provision that is a primary school, and whatever. For adult education, it's not as simplistic as that. So they have a really good mapping of what the ecosystems are and the interactions between the different stakeholders. But I think we also need to, do some further digging down in, having the countries really think about what they want in who has to take the responsibility. Because in an ecosystem, you could argue it's a shared responsibility, right? But here, I'll tell you, interesting question that someone told me who actually ran a big survey on adult education in the United Kingdom. It's if you ask people in the general population on whether the government needs to sponsor participation in adult education, does the government needs to financially support adults who want to continue their training? Actually, quite a lot of people will say, yes, the government needs to sponsor that. Now, if you ask a fairly similar sample the question of whether the taxpayer needs to support, lots of people say, oh, the taxpayer, that's me. No, not the taxpayer. If people want to do it, they need to, so you know what I mean? It is also a bit if you want governments to support it, people also need to be aware that, it needs to be part of your social policies and whatever, and just fine-tuning there's huge variety of how countries deal with these things. And that's why in an Eastern European country like Romania, you have participation rates of not even 5%. But in a country like Sweden or some of the Scandinavian countries, on an annual basis, it sits over over 50%. So that is really an example on how your macro level structure can make a difference. But on the other hand, as I say, in a country like Sweden, you also have people who are not interested in taking part, right? So it is also a bit like the individual themselves also needs to do the effort and needs to understand and recognize that there's something in there for them. And I think there it's a bit like when, as a country, you give incentives. One of the things that actually happens is that quite often incentives are sort of one size fits all incentive. Once you hand out something for free, it's usually the people who have already a lot who will take it. And that is something you see with work that I've done on training vouchers, for example, in the Flemish Dutch-speaking system in Belgium. The government had a system where people could buy training vouchers, then they got like reduction on enrollment fees. But at a certain point, they changed the system because the majority of these checks were actually bought up by people who already had university degrees. So, it's these sort of things that we all sort of need to keep thinking about. And yeah, sort of hopefully it will sort of, But I think maybe one other last point I want to say about that as well is that some of these actions will also really need long-term thinking. And that is a bit where governments are typically only in charge for like 4 or 5 years. And then every prime minister that comes in, they say, oh, I am going to do something. And then they launch a project. And then, once the project takes off, they're 2 years in post. And then they run the project for a year. Then they maybe lose the elections or whatever. Someone else comes. And then the other person that comes in is going to have their own castle that they're going to build and their own sort of idea that they want to put forward. And then you actually run the risk that your policies are just going to consist of temporary projects. So you need to be able to build these temporary projects into long-term stable infrastructures. Because otherwise it's just it's like a sandcastle, right? You build a nice castle, but by the time you leave, the sea will just wash it away with the ebb and the flow of ministers come and go. So that's another point I want to add into that.
Well, with this metaphor of the castle wash up, we are right to the end of our conversation. Thanks a lot, Ellen, for sharing this field that we don't talk a lot in education, which is training of adults, development of skills for adults. And that has a lot of challenges, as you said, and as population ages and also the changes that we have, it becomes more and more important. So I want to thank you for your time, your insights on this field of adult competencies and lifelong learning. And
thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I need to thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you. And let's continue our conversation soon.
Cheers. Thank you. Will do.
Thank you.
For more information, visit observatory.tech.mx/EduTrends podcast and ife.tech.mx. A special thanks to Tecnológico de Monterrey, the Institute for the Future of Education, and the Tech Sounds team. EduTrends producers Esteban Venegas and Christian Igosa. Stay tuned and play Tech Sounds in your favorite podcast app for other great shows and content.